Ready? Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Isabella Elahe Hughes, and I am an independent curator, art critic, and the co-founder and director emeritus of the Honolulu Biennial Foundation, which every 2 years puts on an incredible international biennial that focuses on linking the cultures and countries that are connected through the Pacific Ocean. So we hope to welcome all of you at the next one in 2021. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to be here today with my esteemed colleagues who actually are also very dear friends, and they've come all the way out to Abu Dhabi for our panel, Rising from the Pacific, Emerging Contemporary Art Centers. I'm joined by Dr. Conrad Ng, the Executive Director of the Shangri-La Museum of Islamic Art, Culture, and Design. You can tell I'm going to read their titles, so I make sure they're absolutely perfect. Chris Saines in the beautiful orange shirt. And Chris is the director of the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art in Brisbane. And Nina Tonga, who most recently was the curator of the 2019 Honolulu Biennial. And she's also the curator of contemporary art at the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa. And we are so honored to be here because to our knowledge, this is the very first conversation in Abu Dhabi and perhaps really the UAE that's focused on the Pacific region where all of us are from and or based in. And for me, this is very much of a homecoming. I actually was born and raised in Honolulu, and I spent nearly 6 years living and working in the United Arab Emirates. And if you told me the first time I came to this incredible country about a decade ago that I'd be back and I'd be talking about the Pacific, I probably would not have believed it. And we've been so welcomed by the Abu Dhabi art team and really overcome with their tremendous generosity. So on behalf of myself and my panelists, we want to thank Abu Dhabi Art for hosting us and for really offering this platform for this trailblazing conversation that really supports, I think, what we all are dedicating our personal and professional lives to, which is giving greater agency and voice to the dynamic and multifaceted contemporary art scene in the Pacific. So the way that this panel is going to work, since I think for many of you these are new faces and perhaps new regions and institutions, is each one of my panelists are going to get up, very speed fire, and for 3 minutes, we're going to time them, give a brief introduction to their organization and their work, and then we're going to move into hopefully what is an informal and very fun conversation. So without further ado, would you like to start, Conrad?
Yeah, thank you.
Mahalo.
Aloha, everyone. Just very quickly to echo our thanks to Abu Dhabi Art for the invitation and to speak, and my thanks to Elahe and to Isabella, to Isabella and my colleagues for joining me on this panel. They're tremendous. Just very quickly, I am the executive director of a Museum of Islamic Art, Culture, and Design that's located in Honolulu, Hawaii. It's the only standalone museum of Islamic art in the United States, one of 2 in North America. You might ask, how is that possible in a place like Honolulu? Just very quickly, our collection was created by Doris Duke. Doris Duke in the early 30s was one of the richest women in the world. During her honeymoon, she traveled from North Africa to South Asia, from Morocco to India, and discovered the arts, culture, and people of Islamic worlds, and was so enamored by it, she decided that she wanted to build a collection, to build a home, reflecting the architectural and cultural traditions of those regions. At the end of her honeymoon, she ended up in Honolulu, Hawaii, and fell in love with the people who embraced her. And she decided to commission her home and build her collection in that place. This is just some shots of the interior. You'll see that some of the rooms and gallery spaces that originally part of her estate were commissioned after Mughal-style architecture from Syrian Damascus interiors and the like. You'll see in the slide, the museum is located on the ocean front. Over the 80 so years after Shangri-La was built, she amassed a collection of some 4,000 objects representing those traditions from Syria, from from the Middle East, from India, from Morocco, from a number of regions which we have on display. One of the things that we do now is that we have an artist residency program. We invite exhibition artists who work in a variety of arts, from performing arts to hip hop to painting, and we have them spend some time with the museum to create works that reflect and comment on our collection. In this slide, we have a work by Iko Nugroho, who's based in Indonesia. A lot of the work generated by our artists is to serve as a moral compass, as it were, to really make the connection between the artwork of worlds from which people draw their inspiration or draw their culture from to the worlds of today. We can see in our residency program, we have a number of public programs that we build around this, from a program that we've branded called Listening While Muslim, which looks at American popular culture through the Muslim experience, to performances, to a workshop on the secret Muslim life of coffee and the like, to performances like of hip-hop and soul music. So a lot of our work bridges from the exhibition of artwork that's generated from people like Have Karhaman, who did a recent exhibition, to Fag Ahmad, who's a textile artist, to some of the performing artists that you see in this slide. That's the nature of our museum today, is to be that bridge, to be that place for people to find and discover what inspires them, to find and discover their traditions, their heritage, but also to find and discover their voice. A lot of what we want to do at Shangri-La is to empower those voices from around the world, and bring them together to be able to share, to be able to inspire, to be able to create. And in a nutshell, hopefully I think I've under 3 minutes, that's Shangri-La. Thank you.
That was perfect.
Thank you, Conrad. You set the timing bar high. I'm equally delighted, along with my colleagues, to be here at Abu Dhabi Art. It's a great privilege. I've not been to the city before, and I'm blown away by what I've experienced here, and very much looking forward to seeing more of it in the next few days. I'm Chris Sainz, the director of the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery of Modern Art, and it's my honour today to say a little bit about the Asia Pacific Triennial. The Triennial was established in 1993, when initially there was just the Queensland Art Gallery. I was working there at the time as an assistant director when the first two triennials were developed, and it had an enormous impact on Australia at that moment. And I think it's reasonable to say, pardon me, in the time since, there's been a tremendous global impact that's washed out from this exhibition. We draw artists, of course, from Australia, which is the kind of centre of the Asia Pacific region for us. We draw out into the broader Pacific, and we go deep into the Pacific, not just to Aotearoa, but to small island archipelagos in Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia, of course, including Hawaiʻi in our last exhibition. And as well as that, we go right across Asia, into West Asia, indeed up into the Middle East. We go right through China, around Southeast Asia. It's a very all-encompassing exhibition. The slides I'm going to show you are taken from major works that we commissioned, in most cases, for the last Asia Pacific Triennial. And the first one is a work by Jonathan Jones. He's a Wiradjuri Indigenous Aboriginal man from northern New South Wales. And he created, and I'm glad about the screen because it was on a curved wall, and there were 1,754 of these very small objects that are really all based upon tools used for hunting and gathering and sustaining life among the early members of that community, of the Wiradjuri community. It's a wonderful work that is about a murmuration of birds. It's about language and the way that language transmits through space and through time. This is a work that we had made by a group of women from the Marshall Islands. The jacket, the design that they're showing, was formerly made as a clothing, as a formal dress textile, but now smaller, sort of mat-sized works are made using exactly the same patterns and the same stories are told. This is a collaborative, collective, community-based work which we were instrumental in facilitating along with the University of the South Pacific. A work that might not need much introduction, seen at the second to last Venice Biennale, an extraordinary work by Lisa Rayhana, which runs for 64 minutes, and it's on a long screen, almost more than the length of this room. And what you see is this passing parade of life in the Pacific during the time of the early 18th century voyages by de Bougainville and by Captain James Cook, but reanimated from Pacific community perspectives. Chris Chartress, an artist who thought he was Māori, in fact turned out that he was Fijian, English, and also had family in the Kiribati. So he's created a body of work which is all about traditional Kiribati weapons and implements, fish traps in the foreground, and a coconut fibre suit of armour on the left. And finally, a beautiful work made by a group of artists from the East New Britain province in Papua New Guinea. And these are called toloi, or shell rings, which have a sort of currency of exchange. They actually have the same value as kina, the ordinary Papua New Guinean currency. And this is a work that emphasizes we don't just work with people like Lisa making very contemporary artworks, we use customary work and present it in a very contemporary way. So I've probably run a little over, I apologize, but I hope that gives you a sense of the kind of work that we make for the Asia Pacific Triennial. Thank you. That's really good.
Kia ora koutou, malo lelei, malo tau mau I he whiawhini. I greet you in the language of my home, Auckland, Aotearoa, New Zealand. I now reside in Wellington, but also in the language of my homeland, the Kingdom of Tonga. My name is Nina Tonga. I am the Curator of Contemporary Art at the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa. Te Papa, as it's most commonly referred to, Te Papa Tongarewa translates into Reo Māori as a container of treasures. And it is our national museum. And it was designed from its very beginning as a bicultural institution. It acknowledges Te Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi, and the role of tangata whenua, the first peoples of the land, as well as the role of tangata tiriti, the people who belong to New Zealand by way of the treaty. The bicultural ethos of Te Papa provides a framework for all that we do. It infiltrates all aspects of our practice as a museum, from our conceptual development right through to our operating frameworks and to our governance. The leadership of Te Papa is a partnership between our CEO and our kaihotu, our Māori leader, which reflects the bicultural nature of the museum. Our role as a museum is to be a forum for the nation, to present and preserve its culture, its heritage, and its natural environment. Unique to Te Papa, and I welcome you all to visit when you do come to New Zealand, is that the building itself holds a fully functional marae, a meeting place, that was created by the late Cliff Whiting, an artist, but also was kaihotu of our museum. And this particular marae symbolises a lot of the kind of principles of Te Papa as a museum, but also as a place for all people to stand and to belong. One of the guiding principles of Te Papa, in terms of our curatorial practice, is mana taonga. And mana taonga recognises that there exists for living peoples a relationship and connection between taonga, or treasures, or museum collection objects and artworks, and their cultures of origin, and that the communities for which have connections to collections in taonga have a role to play in their ongoing preservation, in their display, and in their interpretation. Mana taonga as a principle has really been something that's guided how we have been working with Pacific people in the museum space and in the Pacific, and I'll talk a bit about that. This particular slide I wanted to share because this is where we really are working at, I would believe, the kind of forefront of our own museology and thinking about how we work with communities. This image is of a student that participated in one of our co-collecting projects. And in this co-collecting project, we partnered with a local school to think about how they would represent their lives as Tongan youth living in New Zealand, so living in diaspora communities away from their homeland. What would they choose to give to the museum? And the way that we were shaping our thought is that they were not source communities. These were our partners. They described themselves as agents, as youth agents in the field. We took inspiration by other cultural projects happening in the Pacific, particularly the Vanuatu Cultural Field Workers Program, and we enlisted these students to decide what would be represented in the collection and what they opened up for us in terms of shaping our collection and values, we probably did not expect we were going to get. So this is Samuela Baia, and he gave us his very first trumpet that he ever received. And he chose it not just because it said something about him, about his ability to play a trumpet, but also for the genealogy. It passed through his family. And what you can't see on the case are these drawings Samuela made when he was very young. And he said that he drew on the case because this was pre-cell phones, and he was waiting for his dad to pick him up. And for us at Te Papa, what we're looking after, we really see our role as being kaitiaki or guardians, is not just objects, but we're also looking after the stories that go with them. And last year, one of our major projects was redeveloping our art gallery, Toi Art. And in the conceptual development, we asked ourselves, and we challenged ourselves more to reflect Aotearoa, New Zealand, our place in the Pacific, and then from this place in the Pacific to the world. And it forced us to reconsider how we work with our artists. There were a lot of collaborations with artists, with knowledge holders, with practitioners to build our collection, but also to build a suite of opening exhibitions. And the largest exhibition of opening was the Pacific Sisters. The Pacific Sisters is a collective that emerged out of Auckland, an urban centre of New Zealand. And this was their first survey exhibition. And for us, it was about repositioning Pacific art histories, not just being local and urban, but being part of a national story. So for the sisters, this was not just about what they did in Auckland, but how they shaped an identity for New Zealand and for other Pacific communities. Beyond our own work in our own museum, we have also started to work beyond the walls and think about our engagement in the Pacific. And the most recent project was the Honolulu Biennial, and I want to acknowledge Isabella here, as well as members of the board who really provided this platform for Pacific art to really thrive in the region. And my role in this was really supported by our institution, Te Papa, as being a way in which we could start to work out in the Pacific more actively as part of a network that we see sustaining contemporary art in the region. So, thank you.
Thank you all for those fantastic introductions and amazing visuals. So having lived and worked in the MENA region, I think what's really interesting the past 10 to 15 years is artists that were once really represented specifically in this region, now you can find them all over the world, in museum collections, in galleries, in fairs, biennials. And the reason that we really are here today is because we're talking about the Pacific. So for our purposes of the conversation, we're defining and focusing on the Pacific as Aotearoa, Australia, Polynesia, and Hawaii. And the first really discussion point I'd love to get us started with is, why has the Pacific been left out of this global conversation on contemporary art?
I think it's too hard. I think there are too many remote places in the Pacific that people find it hard to leave the centre and very intrepidly travel. I mean, we've just sent a curator to Rapa Nui. To get there, she has to go via Chile. So it's a very complex part of the world to navigate for people. And I think that's one of the sort of most direct answers to that question. It's more complex, but I think that what we've tried to do through the Triennial, and what I think is occurring through the Honolulu Biennial as well, is we're trying to break that barrier down by going into the region and traveling regularly. And with the Asia Pacific Triennial, we've been traveling into the Pacific for almost 30 years. And curators like our current Pacific curator, Ruth McDougall, has relationships that when I go with her into Papua New Guinea, I get met on the street by people saying, Ruth, like she is known, she is loved, she is respected. And because we have that longitudinal relationship, our access to the Pacific, and particularly to the women of the Pacific who are often practicing quite humble, traditional art forms, and we work with them in order to reconstitute some of those lost art forms as well and reinstate them. We did it in Bougainville last year. We did it in the Marshall Islands through the project that was run there. And I think that this kind of cultural recovery work is something that's really important in the Pacific. There are a lot of communities that are ruled by men, and there are also communities ruled by women. And in the communities ruled by women, the really good stuff happens. So much so we were given an estate to actually just invest in the work of women in the Pacific, the Oceania Women's Fund. And that's really changed the dial for us. But look, I'm sorry, I'll leave it there. The others, I'm sure, have got things to say. But it's a hard place to get to. But once you get into the Pacific, you fall in love with it.
I agree around the hardship, but I think the geography and the distance issue is something that is, if we were to spin the world around and focus the conversation in our part of the world, is something that we accept as a reality of the kind of conditions of our region. And for example, New Zealand, the closest place is 3 hours away, and that might seem a distance for a lot of people, but that's quite close for us. And I think the other thing too is that to acknowledge is that there are multiple conversations going on. And so while there is one global, well, there's probably multiple global conversations where the Pacific features really prominently. If I think about the idea around Indigenous art, Pacific artists have really been involved in that space, particularly New Zealand artists have featured quite prominently, I think, in the kind of regular biennials that come from Australia, equally from Canada. So I think there are global conversations that are changing, if I can make that observation quite early. And when I think about global conversations around art, if I think about where people from the Pacific are really leading, I would probably refer to someone like Luke Willis-Thompson getting nominated at the Tate. I think those things are showing us that we're connecting more and more, that the distance, I think, is slightly decreasing, if I can make that sense.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. It's a great question, and you know, when I think about the Pacific, I don't. First of all, I think of it in the plural. There's multiple Pacifics. There's experiences in which define the Pacific in individual ways, but also common ways of shared heritage, shared cultural language, and the like. But I don't think it's overlooked so much at all. I mean, I think that the Pacific in an artistic conversation might be overlooked. But in the economies of labor, migration, and other ways, the Pacific's been mined, right? It's been taken to support other cultural industries, whether it's through cheaper labor or through the export of people. And that idea that those people carry with culture and creative voices, those add to the syncretism of other economies, other nations, and then it's forgotten. And I think that our work, whether it's a triennial, whether it's through biennials or through a museum, is to do a work of excavation, right? It's the idea that there are these transnational circuits which are already in place, whether to support other countries and other places, for example, like the American Empire or the like. The Pacific has been there, and Pacific peoples have always been there. It's just that now we're excavating how they've contributed culturally and creatively. I always think of this example of Wikipedia, which most people know, and the old notion of a wiki, which is a Hawaiian concept. The idea of something quick is there. It's in our common lexicon. We understand it very quickly. Again, that's an idea of mining the Pacific for concepts which are exportable in other places, but we haven't done the excavation to understand that we're connected in that way. So in artistic conversations, it's not so much overlooked, it's just we've chosen to be discriminate about how other cultural economies, creative economies, are enabled by these Pacific peoples and experiences. And that's something that I want to do, or at least we try to do in the work at the Shangri-La, is to try to find the connective resonance that we have with artists from around the world, but also local artists. So we're not privileging, for example, someone whose residence is in a country around the world, but that they have a voice that can be heard in the Pacific, and vice versa, that someone can find that resonance in that way.
I think it's interesting, just reflecting on this question as well, and hearing what Nina and Conrad have said, that when we first began to develop the Asia-Pacific Triennial, our notion of the Pacific was to begin with Aotearoa. That's where we went, and that's where it's the largest Polynesian city in the world is Auckland. You know, that's astonishing, but it is. And so all of these Pacific peoples that were coming, particularly through the 50s and 60s, and it was all about labor and about, you know, creating opportunities for their families as well as working and gaining work that wasn't available to them often in their homelands. And the thing I love that's happening now, here we are 25 years later from that first APT, some of the greatest artists in New Zealand among whom I would count John Poole, a great artist, has gone back to live in his homeland in Niue and to write there and work there and paint there. And I think Ani O'Neill has gone back to the Cooks as well. So these are artists that we've had in the Triennial who we took off their Auckland base. And now what they're doing is, instead of just using Auckland as a platform, they're actually returning to countries of origin, working with community, working with families. And I think that's going to be the next renaissance, you know, the next wave of young Pacific artists are going to emerge from the great leadership of people like Ani and John, actually working with them locally rather than working with them in New Zealand.
And I couldn't agree with you more on that point. And also to add the curators, I mean, what we see in Hawaiʻi is, you know, traditionally there is no real master's program in curatorial studies, but we have curators like Josh Tengan, who is the assistant curator of the Honolulu Biennial, Drew Broderick, who recently took a position at the Koa Art Gallery, go away for the education, but rather than go and live in a major city, they come back home, and that's an equally important conversation about the scene.
And I think that's a good point too, Chris, about talking about Auckland as this example of an art scene that is now, I think, quite strong now. You know, like in the 90s was a high point. We're now getting another generation of artists, but also that scene changes from place to place, where some places don't have the same infrastructure, where art can thrive, where curatorial practices are starting to emerge. So it's quite a diverse range of, I guess, art practices and communities that happen. And there's also that, something, Conrad, that you were saying, I just want to riff off a bit about in terms of art, Pacific art and artists appearing in conversation. So I think there's a lot of agency and a real kind of intention about where art practice should be and who it speaks to. And sometimes that's causing some of the dynamics that we're seeing, where we do have artists working offshore, but there are other artists that are quite grounded in being based in the region or being based in the Pacific.
Yeah, I do think that there is no shortage of voices in the Pacific, or strong voices, which are tied to articulating in a fully throated way the assertion of agency in the Pacific, and the necessity of building the infrastructure that we're talking about. But it's not so much overlooked as that kind of grassroots, raw emergence, right? That is, you know, the title of this panel. Can put some people off, right? Because art, at which I think some of our institutions and some of the ways in which our festivals and organizations have understood it to be, in my sort of practice or my understanding is that art has its sort of aesthetic and historic and stylistic values. But today, the powerful voice of artists who say that social change is necessary, or these are my traditions and they need to be acknowledged. Those can be off-putting for those people who want or desire to see art to just see it as an aesthetic tradition, something that's placid. And I think that the Pacific has got, you know, we'll note that it may seem like a gender term, but there's a muscularity, I think, about the emergence of the Pacific to understand it, or a birthing, to use another gendered term. I think is very profound, and that may not sort of register in the artistic circuits that are happening around the world. And I think that's what's beautiful about the Pacific, and what I think is important about our work.
I think another thing is that the Pacific and the way we work with and interpret art from the Pacific has radically changed. You go back to that now highly problematical Gauguin view of the Pacific, in which what he was doing was returning with, as collectors like Max Ernst and Picasso and others, they were collecting work from the Pacific as artifact, as evidence of some sort of primitive culture which was somehow spiritually connected in ways that the West did not see itself operating in that same sort of global paradigm. And instead of the Pacific now being a place of curiosity for people like that, I think that there's more a sense that when we at my institution engage with the Pacific, we're trying to do so on terms that are equal and equivalent to the way in which we deal with an artist from Denmark or, you know, or an artist from Japan. What we're trying to do is to work with people in a way that brings the best forward from them, that gives, you know, a very authentic expression of their cultural language and belief systems. And I think that if you lend respect to working with artists in that way, the most remarkable things can come, whether it's a work from an artist from China or a work from, you know, a really remote archipelago in the Marshall Islands or something. So I think these are small communities which often don't have the art ecology of the big Berlins and Londons and New Yorks and what have you. So to a certain extent, you've got to go and you've got to build relationships in order to get the best work from those communities in order to be able to even show it within biennial and triennial type settings. And then bring as many of those communities as you possibly can. We had 30 come from Bougainville for the last exhibition, for argument's sake. So if you're going to work with community, bring community. If you're going to work with an individual artist, bring that artist. I think those sorts of things are kind of changing the register now.
I could not agree with you more, and I think that's something I know with my own work with Honolulu Biennial that's been incredibly important for us, that you cannot just plop art.
No.
This is a relationship. We're a culture of mo'olelo, storytelling in the Pacific, and bringing the artist and having them engage with community, being a very community-focused region, especially with making. I know a lot of us can reference point works where the artist has worked with community, actually create the work, is really central to the success of our region, which I think leads to sort of the next discussion point I'd love us to move on to, which is really talking about the infrastructure and the role that, whether it's a residency program that you may be running, Conrad, or, you know, art fairs, biennials, you know, and they're all really set up for intense cross-cultural exchange to help raise the profile of artists from the Pacific, both indigenous and based and born and raised there. You know, how is the work that you're doing really lending to this?
Yeah.
I'll go first, and I think I'd like to talk about the biennial as this quite a unique opportunity to be a bit radical, to kind of say something about the region, and the Honolulu Biennial really felt like that for us in the region. It was something new. It was something that centered us in the island, in one of the islands. And I think what I love about the biennial as a model, and the model that we proposed, is that we were thinking, what is the most important thing to us in this region? And it was people, it was relationships, it was creating something that was grounded in place, didn't speak for others, but it had a kind of connection to it. And I think in terms of the biennial, what we constantly asked ourselves, and I think I do this in my role as a curator at the museum, is what do you leave behind? What are you leaving behind to nurture? And biennials, they activate a set of relationships over a very intense time. But what I think can come from it is a kind of lasting impact and lasting relationships that you may not be able to service every day, but that will continue to be serviced as you need them or as you activate them. And I think for me, in terms of its role, the biennial has a particular audience, and we're all aware of that. It is a wonderful international audience. So for many artists, this is their international kind of platform to show themselves, show their work to the world, to an international audience. I also believe it awards a certain freedom. It allows them to be brave. One of the conversations that we often had with artists in the last iteration of the biennial was if you could put money aside. And I know money is, and you know, funding is a huge thing, but what we realize is how much of a block that puts on creativity. So as curators, we said, don't worry about that, put that on us. Let us take that burden, and what is the work you need to make for this time and this moment? And I think letting artists in a biennial kind of model lead the way is something that we saw as an opportunity to not only just show work, but to say something real about the moment that we're in, about climate change, about the way they felt, about the kind of politics of their islands, of their nations, around history. And I think the biennial offers that, not just about profile, but it offers us an opportunity to use a biennial to experiment and to explore and to push.
Another way of conceiving of the Pacific as a kind of entity, a global entity, is its geostrategic importance at the moment. And I attended a lecture a couple of weeks ago by a woman who was very expert in this area and is the CEO of the Pacific Economic Forum. And not only was the conversation about the existential threat that's posed by climate change and rising sea levels, and there are in fact countries now land banking in Fiji because their own islands are going to be too small for them to feasibly occupy in the future. This is happening. So it really is a major threat to the ongoing existence of those peoples and of those cultures. But what was interesting in that talk, she talked about Australia having a so-called step up in its relationship with the Pacific, about other communities. Belt and Road was the China relationship, building trade routes into and across the Pacific for its own geopolitical and strategic purpose, including the building of bases and so on. So there's the politics of the Pacific, I think, have never been more hypercharged than they are at the moment, despite the sad history of colonisation of many Pacific countries and communities, despite the fact that places like Australia had the awful blackbirding trade where we bought people from New Caledonia and Fiji as indentured labourers in our own cane fields. And the same thing happened in Honolulu, in Hawaiʻi, I should say. So, there's been this kind of problematic issue around migration, immigration, and so on. But by the same token, we've often gone into the Pacific, and I speak as an Australian going into PNG. The mining that we did in PNG devastated many of those communities. So now we've got an opportunity as a contemporary society to try and remedy and reconcile some of those harms that we've also done by our own incursions into the Pacific. And this is where working in the region with artists and giving them that voice to be able to express what's going on in their lives. I think of Taloi Havini, a beautiful young woman who's a PNG woman who also works in Sydney. She creates these videos, one of them in the first Biennale in Honolulu, and it's taking the lid off what's actually going on in places like the remotest corners of PNG. And all of a sudden, I think our attention is drawn to these issues much more fully than if we were left uninformed by no art coming out of those regions and landing in its biennials and festivals, and triennials around the world. So I think we've got a very heavy duty of care and responsibility, and I don't mean that in a patronising sense. I mean it in a sense of working with Pacific artists and communities in that it's important that we give them the agency we have through big institutions to present their work to the world and to tell their story to the world.
I think what's common, say, among this infrastructure that's composed, or an ecosystem that's composed of biennials, festivals, museums, is this common belief that, at least the one that I would like us to think is a common belief, is that art is oxygen. Right? Is oxygen for life. And the fact that human endeavors in human life, we believe, right? We fabricate, we create to fashion beliefs into the world. And what's important in this infrastructure is to invest in them, right? Into creating this ecosystem to sustain it, whether it's through different forms of patronage, whether it's the private collectors, whether it's a public government. I think that's critical. I mean, critical across the Pacific, but around the world, to have fairs like this one with support among collectors and the government, the biennial from private support and some from public, and even having these opportunities such as museums, public museums that or institutions that we work at or run, to give a chance for anybody to walk in through the door. I mean, Nina and I were talking about this this morning, was that part of this infrastructure is creating opportunity, right? One, to recognize that artists have a voice and they're important. They're important to life. They're important to how we believe ourselves to be in the world, but creating this opportunity for the world to come in with a very low threshold, right? I think you can come in so long as you don't destroy the art. Yeah, in fact, you can come in without your shoes on, right? I mean, it's a low threshold. But that's so critical. If we value that, people who collect or buy art, whether it's for their own home or at least from some understanding that it will belong to a home that becomes public, like in my case, I think that infrastructure is critical. And it's so critical, but it's always so fragile, right? I mean, sometimes you're one grant away or one cultivation dinner away from securing a particular work or securing a venue or securing the funding to have that opportunity. And I think that's really critical to be underscored regardless of where we're speaking, but it's urgent for the Pacific.
I think too, for many communities in the Pacific, it's important that organisations like ours work to tell their story in the broader world, as art fairs do and as other events elsewhere in the world do. And I think of a wonderful man called Gideon Kakabun, who passed away 2 years ago, but he was a great facilitator working on behalf of the Gunatuna community in East New Britain province. And that's where the Baining masks are made, the ones with the big sort of googly eyes and extraordinary masks that are used as part of fire dance ceremonies, which I had the great privilege with Ruth of being the only two white faces in a sea of maybe 300 local villages up in this very remote part of East New Britain, watching these young men perform in these masks and coming out of the bush in a way that makes the hairs on the back of your neck really stand up. Live snakes are involved. They walk through the fire. It's electrifying. We have those masks in our museum. Those masks were gifted to us. We didn't buy those masks. They were made for us. They were performed with us present, or at least two representatives of the museum. And for Gideon, what mattered was that those masks were going to tell the story of his people in a museum that was world-renowned for its commitment to the art of the Pacific. So we didn't just go in with a big checkbook. Most of what we buy in the Pacific, we're helping facilitate its making as much as we are buying it transactionally as one does at an art fair. And I think, back to your story before about people and relationships, that's my theme, really. If you build relationships, then you do find ways of sharing the oxygen of your culture and your life and your community with other communities elsewhere. And that helps to build understanding of issues and challenges and everything else. And if we know more about the way in which people live and work in the world, we're surely going to be a more tolerant and inclusive world, and we need more of that, not less.
You know, this is really interesting, because I was just thinking about your comment. I mean, both of your comments had really got me thinking about a few things that have been sort of bouncing around in my brain, especially here in the last couple days. You know, I was thinking that art is oxygen for life, and I was thinking, well, what are the accelerants? And I was just thinking about like social media and just visiting, the Grand Mosque, and I said, it has its own Instagram handle, right? I mean, it's beautiful, and it celebrates a lot of tradition there. And then I started thinking about this conversation that's bouncing around at the Alliance of American Museums. Is the Museum of Ice Cream a real museum? Right? It was a question mark. And I think about, that speaks to the age we're in, because it's not, who knows how long Facebook or other these technologies or platforms will exist. But is that part of the infrastructure, right? That we're talking about, or the ecosystem? Yeah. Is the relationships that we're trying to build are supposed to outlive those, right? I mean, I'm just bouncing it around in my brain.
Yeah, I guess when we collect, we're creating that continuity. And with the Asia Pacific Triennial, we collect around 70% of the work. So everything that you saw here, we acquired, and 4 of the 5 works we commissioned. So we're working to enable, we're working to basically create capacity in often very small communities that don't otherwise have the need to even make some of the material that they make in order to sell it to us and for us to include it within exhibitions and in turn in collections. So we've got a very large contemporary Pacific collection and a very diversely geographically spread one. And I can't imagine what that will feel like in 100 years' time, when so many of these practices, particularly as the life and living conditions within some part of the Pacific that may be under threat, certainly the threat they're facing today, we're acting to create a kind of a cultural arc for a lot of that material. And that's why I think people have been so generous in wanting to bestow their material upon us, not just to transact some exchange of income for work. So I think I think the work we're all doing at the moment is profoundly important in ensuring that these stories continue to be told, despite the fact that many of these communities may very sadly be fragmented as a consequence of just things going on in the world, let alone the impact of climate change.
I think too, what we're describing is a really different kind of museum / cultural space, where the old museum idea of a treasure house perhaps is gone, and we're trying to think about what is the role of museums in the region, what are the people that we work for and whom we represent, how do they see us and how will they use us in the future. So I think it is a changing space. I think the way that we're working with artists and likely with our own communities, seeing them as co-collectors is a rapid shift for us, where they're making the choices based on their cultural knowledge and what I think they should be shaping, which is the value of things. Because I think for museums we could never stay up to date. I mean, I think we're always a couple steps behind. But I've always had this ethos, and maybe this is because I'm from the Kingdom of Tonga, bringing everyone with you. So how do we, I think in all our jobs we're doing it in different ways. Trying to figure out paths and routes that are easier, that bring lots of people in, that allow them to not only access collections, but to use them. And I want to quote Kapolani Landgraf. She said this thing, and we've talked about it a lot after the biennial, of the word of to use something. And I think that's what we're all doing in different ways, and what our communities and artists are doing. They're using museums and platforms and biennials and exhibitions in very different ways than what we were seeing before. They're using them to enable, whether it's engagement with their own communities or whether they're using it to act as a repository for their own stories. And sometimes we're not getting all the stories, and I quite love that. It's probably not a good museum hat thing to say. I love that they're protecting some things for themselves and that we are not the place for it. And I think that's something that we're seeing a lot more often. I think that's also about building relationships takes time. And sometimes I often say it'll take me 1,000 cups of teas with a mama before I could even ask for something. But that's, I think, the dynamics we're working in, where we're changing our spaces and our exhibitions and our models to suit the communities we're working for. And that feels great. I think as someone in the Pacific, that there is the freedom and agency to do so.
So I think, definitely from our conversation, something, and the Pacific being so vast, there are many Pacifics as we began our conversation with, but relationships are just a key theme of our own infrastructure, both in the creative fields that we all are in, but it's how we live our daily existence. And really pulling the conversation, back to art, it'd be really interesting to hear from all of you, and feel free to reflect in your own immediate communities or the broader region. But what are some of the themes that you're seeing come in terms of art making right now in the 21st century? The artists, whether it's from Honolulu, Aotearoa, or Australia, or again, holistically, this broad, vast, many Pacific region, you feel really come out strongly saying, these are the critical issues that artists right now are really addressing. I think it'd be really interesting for our audience to hear about this.
Maybe a quick response to that would be community and sort of building, and in many cases rebuilding community after the rigours of, in some ways, being exploited for your natural resources. I think of PNG when I say that in particular, and a feeling that communities must and need to survive. That is absolutely essential. And I think that the Pacific is comprised, and I think of Indigenous Australians, Torres Strait Islanders, Aboriginal artists in there as well. We have, I think, some of the world's most resilient communities in our different lands and within the Pacific itself. And I think that everything that we're doing at the moment with those communities through the Asia Pacific Triennial is really giving them a voice to tell community stories. This is different from what we do with Korea, where often we're dealing with a completely individual story, or China or Japan, but in the Pacific, this community way of working, I think of women making tavaivai. I think of women gathered around, and there's a beautiful statement that Sanabala, a wonderful curator from Melbourne, PNG woman, who co-curated our Women's Wealth Project in APT9. And there was a thing written above the wall of all of these women's works of baskets and headdresses and so on. It said that when we come together as a group, we don't come together as mothers, we don't come together as wives, we don't come together as people working in the community, we just come together as women. And that's the only space when we're working around a table together or sitting on mats on the floor together, that's the only way we're truly being women. And I thought that was a really quite profound way of saying how these practices, when they're renewed and refreshed, can actually rebuild what is often sort of damaged community infrastructure in terms of culture. And I think it is that oxygen that Conrad talked about. That's what keeps cultures alive when they're often facing quite serious threats. You know, alcohol, drugs, these are big issues in many of these communities. And guess who pretty much sorts it all out? The women.
This might be a sort of my own curatorial bias, but the sort of the observation of sort of common themes would, you know, be a disruption. I think we sort of still remain in an age of disruption, agency, the assertion of agency, whether it's gender or native, you know, or community or family. And then there's this last one, which I'm still sort of figuring out, and that's the kind of technology, but not the sort of hyper-modernity of speed, clean lines, and, you know, sort of big data. And I think those are artistic themes that are emerging that I would begin to say, at least in terms of characterizing contemporary art and the artists that come to Shangri-La and reacting to our collection, but also reacting to the times in which are now framing our collection. But again, that's a curatorial bias, because I think those are the edges of trying to push, again, what is art trying to tell us about ourselves, right? In terms of what we look up to in the sky, but also where we're looking forward in terms of direction.
I think in terms of, and very similar to my colleagues here, is that there is, I think, a more an emphasis on process, that the how matters, the how we do it matters, the idea of a collective sitting down together, that's not just about art making, that's about sustaining cultural conversation. That is so integral, not just to making the work, but to life. You know, and having been privy to some amazing women's spaces, you know, so much more conversation happens then about the artwork, and a lot of it is how you learn how to be a member of a community, and how you learn technical skills. So I think in the Pacific region, what I've loved is the continuum of things. So while there are trends that kind of peak and they might be influenced by technology and more global circuits, I think there's been a continuum of art practice that's so integrated into society, because they are tied to gender, they're tied to family, they're tied to how you understand how to move in certain spaces. So the idea of collective practice is coming to the surface of a lot of contemporary art practices, but because it's actually about how a lot of people have come into the world knowing how to make or knowing how to connect. And I think about a collective like the Mataaho Collective, 4 amazing women from New Zealand who make work collectively, works that they could not make individually. And they've really, I think in terms of putting this continuum on a world stage, they've shown the way that collective practice can make such amazing works that are drawn from weaving, they're drawn from pattern, other visual languages. And I think that I see happening more and more, not just collectives in a kind of art form or an art sense, but collectives that exist within a cultural sense as well, because they have these functions of retaining knowledge. The other thing that I've really loved, and this has been something that I've seen over the last perhaps 5 years, is a sense of urgency. And I have to say that because I think the artists have taken on a role of being amazing spokespeople for us around the issues that are at the forefront, or issues that we can't quite speak about. I think about the way they're being unapologetic, and I love that too. I think around artists being quite staunch about particular positions, and the political current, I think of the biennial in Honolulu was a reflection of that. The way that artists are using their practice to speak very loudly and firmly and with intention. So I think there's also, I think as well as this, we're talking about art in isolation. I think if we think about it, art within an ecology, as well as art practice, we have also the rise of scholarship that's coming from the Pacific region that's supporting all of this. that adds volume to the work that's being made. And these things are happening concurrently. So I see what's happening in art being mirrored in curatorial thought and writing, but also in the teachings of scholars that are teaching in universities across the region. So I see maybe the boundaries between art practice and academia and cultural practice becoming way more fluid in a way that makes sense, I think, for the region.
Hearing the three of you speak is always so poetic and so profound. So thank you very, very much for sharing your thoughts with what I really believe is a historic conversation and bringing the Pacific to this region and in an area that means a great deal to me. And we so appreciate the generosity of Abu Dhabi Art Fair for giving us this platform. And hopefully this is the first of many future conversations, including our dynamic corner of the world. But we've got about 5 minutes for Q&A, so we just wanted to open it up. If anybody has any questions for our panelists, we welcome them.
This is the first time that I have been hearing that many times Pacific in 1 hour. So in that case, I cannot stop myself to say that I'm born in one of those Pacifics. So thank you for mentioning that there are many Pacifics, and that was in Ecuador many years ago. So what I wanted to share is that vitality that gave me in this moment a kind of espoir about what's happening in art. And when you talk about that kind of organical state of the art making and the art sharing, that we don't live anymore in the big cities where we live. And this is what happened as well in some countries of South America that didn't become at that point developed in cultural structures. So we have yet the pleasure to feel that people are still living in that effervescence of the art. And actually all of us, we were talking yesterday, who lives in big cities, we are missing that. Like in the times of New York was in the first 80s, 90s, and we used to enjoy and to be there in that cosmogonic, extraordinary feelings that art brings. But that we don't live that anymore when everything is structured at that time. So that is just a comment to share. I am very curious about the subject of the Biennale, the title, the one of Honolulu. Could you explain more or amplify what is to make wrong right now?
Yeah, of course. To make wrong right now comes from the last line of a poem by Imaikalani Kalahele. And when we were in the biennial, and we know the biennial model, often you are a curator, perhaps a local, but a lot of times you are not a local curator and you're an international curator. It's quite funny when I say international because I consider myself another Pacific person, but for me it was that I wasn't from Hawaii. I was a woman from the Kingdom of Tonga coming to Hawaii to curate on another community's land. That is something for me was about reciprocity. How do you reciprocate the wonderful welcome, the openness of the communities to you? And one of the things we wanted to do was to look for the words that come from this place. So we looked at a lot of poems. We looked at this one in particular, and at the time there was a group of us curating and thinking about the development. And the last line stood out for us, to make wrong right now. And depending on when you say it, depending on the timing of the saying it, it could be corrective. But we also wanted to welcome that it could be a bit more openly interpreted, that it could be about making wrong, about being mischievous, and I think artists should be. I encourage them to be. And it could be about a sense of urgency that I talked about right now, about not waiting for conditions to be right to make work, about not waiting for permission, of maybe saying things and apologize later. And I think you can accommodate that in a biennial. So we chose this ending title because we wanted to think about how we could answer that call that was in the poem, to make wrong right now. How do we respond to that in this time from the Pacific? And so the Honolulu Biennial, what is lovely about it is it is in the Pacific, but that it pulls together so many different Pacifics. In this one, we really push the idea of what is the Pacific and where are we talking about. And I often tell people that like my portfolio is a third of the world's surface, because it literally is that big, and it is that diverse and that challenging. So we wanted to have a title like this that opened up the possibility to speak from so many different parts of the Pacific. And I acknowledge too, one of my mentors said to me when I was training as an art historian, wherever you are from is the center of your universe. So if you enabled that in everybody from the Pacific region, what we're then embracing is so many different perspectives, so many different politics, so many rights to wrongs, so many revisionist strategies that we then can perhaps embrace, if only momentarily, the diversity and the richness that is the region. So I hope that kind of answers where we were going with the title, but it really was something that we wanted to stand by as a curatorial team, as something that we could offer, not just the art world in the broad sense, but the Pacific.
Thank you. And wanting to be respectful of time, we don't have any more for questions, but our generous panelists will be right outside if you'd like to chat with them. I know they would love to chat with you. So a big mahalo, as we say in Hawaiian, mahalo nui loa, to Abu Dhabi Art for having us here, for giving us this opportunity, and a special thanks to some of my incredible board members from the Honolulu Biennial who've traveled their very first time to the UAE, Taiji Terasaki, Gloria Lau, and Kristen Chan for being here with us, and to all of you for sharing your time.
Thank you.